Beneath the world's holiest landmark lies a labyrinth of secret chambers that most visitors will never see. From papal escape tunnels used during invasions to an astronomy tower that reformed time itself, and even an erotic bathroom painted by Raphael. These restricted spaces have witnessed tears, treasures, and centuries of intrigue. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about hidden rooms inside the Vatican. Fact 1. Bramante's double helix staircase. Predates DNA. Hidden away in the Vatican museums, there's a staircase that looks like it was designed by someone who had seen the structure of DNA, except it was built in 1505, which is more than 400 years before Watson and Crick discovered the double helix. The architect Donato Bramante created this spiral staircase with two separate staircases that wind around each other in perfect harmony, allowing people to go up and down at the same time without ever crossing paths. The design is so ingenious that if you start climbing up one side while your friend descends the other, you'll never meet, even though you're basically occupying the same vertical space. What makes this even more fascinating is how closely the structure resembles the twisted ladder shape of DNA that wouldn't be identified until 1953. The Vatican staircase features two independent spirals that coil around a central column, creating an intertwined pattern that mirrors nature's most fundamental building block. Bramante designed it this way for purely practical reasons, solving the problem of heavy foot traffic in both directions without creating congestion or awkward encounters between people heading opposite ways. The staircase served as a private passage connecting different levels of the Apostolic Palace, and its exclusive nature meant that important visitors could arrive and depart without bumping into others. Today, most tourists never see the original Bramante staircase because it's located in a restricted area of the museums, though there's a more famous modern version called the Momo staircase, built in 1932, that copies the same double helix concept and is often photographed by visitors who think they're seeing the Renaissance original. Fact 2. The Room of Tears houses 3 pope sizes. Right next to the Sistine Chapel, there's a small cramped room that might be the most emotionally overwhelming place in the entire Vatican, and it's called the Room of Tears, or in Italian, the Camera delle Lacrime. This tiny chamber serves one very specific purpose, and it happens immediately after the white smoke rises and a new pope is elected by the College of Cardinals. Inside this room sit 3 identical white papal cassocks in small, medium, and large sizes, along with matching accessories like the white zucchetto skullcap and a simple white fascia sash. The newly elected pope is brought into this room by the master of pontifical liturgical celebrations, where he changes out of his cardinal's red robes and puts on the white vestments that will mark him as the supreme pontiff for the rest of his life. The room gets its name from the fact that almost every pope who has entered it has broken down crying from the sheer weight of what they're about to face. The emotional pressure of accepting leadership over more than 1 billion Catholics worldwide, combined with the knowledge that they'll hold this position until death, overwhelms even the most prepared candidates. Pope Leo XIII reportedly wept in this room because he believed he was too old for the job at 67 years old, though he ended up serving for 25 years and lived to be 93. Pope John Paul II spent several minutes in the Room of Tears composing himself before stepping out onto the balcony in 1978, and witnesses say his eyes were red and puffy when he finally emerged. The room remains one of the most private spaces in Vatican City, and very few people outside the papal household have ever seen inside it. Fact 3. An underground bunker. Stores 85 kilometers of secrets. Beneath the Vatican's elegant courtyards and gardens lies a massive underground storage facility that holds secrets spanning 2,000 years of history, and the scale of this archive is almost impossible to comprehend. The Vatican Secret Archives, which were officially renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archives in 2020 to sound less mysterious, occupy a bunker beneath the Cortile della Pina that extends 2 stories underground with climate-controlled conditions to preserve ancient documents. The shelving inside this facility, if you stretched it out in a single line, end to end, would measure 85 kilometers or about 53 miles, which is longer than the entire distance from Vatican City to the Mediterranean Sea. Inside this underground vault, you'll find everything from handwritten letters by Michelangelo and Galileo to papal bulls that changed the course of European history, along with Henry VIII's request for an annulment and Abraham Lincoln's letter to Pope Pius IX. The archives contain approximately 35,000 volumes of historical records, and that doesn't even count the countless individual documents, scrolls, parchments, and manuscripts that fill the space between them. What makes this bunker particularly secure is its construction, which features thick concrete walls, advanced fire suppression systems, and environmental controls that maintain perfect temperature and humidity levels to prevent deterioration of delicate medieval papers. Access to the archives is extremely restricted, and only about 1,000 qualified scholars per year receive permission to enter and examine documents, and even they can only request 3 specific items per day. The Vatican estimates that if a single researcher wanted to examine every document in the collection, spending just 1 minute with each item, it would take approximately 66 years of continuous reading without breaks. Nobody knows exactly what percentage of the archive's contents have ever been properly cataloged or studied, which means there are probably countless forgotten documents sitting on those 85 kilometers of shelves waiting to be rediscovered. Fact 4. Raphael painted an erotic papal bathroom. One of the most scandalous rooms in the Vatican is a tiny private bathroom that Raphael painted in 1516, and it's so inappropriate that the Catholic Church tried to deny its existence for centuries. The Stufetta del Bibbiena, which translates to the Little Heated Bathroom of Bibbiena, was commissioned by Cardinal Bernardo Dovizi da Bibbiena, who wanted his private bathing room decorated by the greatest artist of the Renaissance. Raphael and his workshop filled the small chamber with frescoes depicting scenes from Roman mythology. But these weren't the usual dignified classical scenes you'd find in public spaces throughout the Vatican. Instead, Raphael painted naked Roman gods and goddesses in various states of undress and erotic activity, including one particularly shocking image that shows the god Pan pleasuring himself while peering at a group of bathing nymphs. The walls also feature Venus and Cupid in intimate poses, along with other mythological figures engaged in activities that would make most visitors extremely uncomfortable, given the building's religious context. What makes this even stranger is that the room was located inside the Vatican's Apostolic Palace, just steps away from where popes conducted official church business and met with visiting dignitaries. The church was so embarrassed by the erotic content that at some point in the 18th or 19th century, someone whitewashed over the frescoes to hide them from view, and Vatican officials simply pretended the room didn't exist or that the stories about Raphael's naughty bathroom were exaggerated legends. It wasn't until the late 20th century that art historians convinced the Vatican to allow restoration work, and conservators carefully removed the layers of paint to reveal Raphael's original frescoes underneath. Even today, the Stufetta del Bibbiena remains off-limits to regular tourists and is only occasionally opened for specialized art history tours or scholarly research, making it one of the most hidden and restricted spaces in the entire Vatican complex. Fact 5. A 200-foot tower reformed the calendar. Standing in a corner of the Vatican museums is a 200-foot tower that literally changed time itself, and without this building, we'd all be celebrating Christmas in early January right now. The Tower of the Winds, or Torre dei Venti, was constructed in 1578 on top of the Gallery of Maps by Pope Gregory XIII, who was deeply concerned about a problem that had been bothering astronomers and mathematicians for centuries. The Julian calendar, created by Julius Caesar in 45 BC, was slowly drifting out of sync with the actual solar year, and by the 16th century, the calendar was running about 10 days ahead of where it should be, according to the Earth's real position relative to the Sun. Pope Gregory commissioned a team of scholars led by astronomer Christopher Clavius to use the Tower of the Winds as an astronomical observatory to precisely measure the solar year and figure out exactly how far off the calendar had drifted. The tower's main chamber features a meridian line built into the floor with a small hole in the south-facing wall that allows sunlight to enter and project onto the floor below. By tracking where the sun's ray hit the meridian line each day, the astronomers could determine the exact dates of the equinoxes and solstices, and their measurements proved that the Julian calendar was gaining approximately 11 minutes and 14 seconds per year, which had accumulated into those 10 missing days. Based on this evidence, Pope Gregory issued a papal bull in 1582 that simply deleted 10 days from the calendar, declaring that October the 4th would be immediately followed by October the 15th, and those 10 dates in between would cease to exist. This created the Gregorian calendar that most of the world still uses today, making it accurate to within 1 day every 3,236 years. The Tower of the Winds also features beautiful frescoes on its walls and ceiling depicting various wind gods from classical mythology, which is how the tower got its name, and the entire space served as both a scientific laboratory and an artistic masterpiece at the same time. Fact 6. The Cabinet of Masks has no actual masks. There's a room in the Vatican museums with one of the most misleading names in art history, and the confusion has been frustrating visitors and scholars for more than 200 years. The Cabinet of Masks, or Gabinetto del Maschere, sounds like it should be filled with ornate Venetian carnival masks or ancient theatrical face coverings, but when you actually see the room, there isn't a single mask hanging on any wall. The name comes from the floor, which features stunning ancient Roman mosaics that were excavated from the ruins of Hadrian's Villa in Tivoli during the 1700s. These mosaics show theatrical masks that were used in Greek and Roman drama, with the comedy and tragedy masks that are still used as symbols of theater today, but they're permanently embedded in the floor tiles rather than being actual masks you could pick up and wear. Pope Pius VI commissioned the creation of this room in 1779 specifically to showcase these incredible mosaics, and he had them installed as the floor covering so visitors could walk directly over 2,000-year-old Roman artwork. The room itself is actually a fairly small side chamber that branches off from the much larger Pio Clementino Museum, and it serves as a transition space between different gallery sections rather than being a major destination on its own. What most people don't realize is that the Cabinet of Masks also contains what curators call the Stone Zoo, which is a collection of ancient marble sculptures depicting various animals, including lions, dogs, horses, and even exotic creatures like crocodiles that Roman artists carved with remarkable anatomical accuracy. These animal sculptures are arranged on pedestals around the perimeter of the room, creating an odd contrast with the theatrical masks on the floor beneath your feet. The entire space is typically closed to regular tourists and only open for special guided tours or research purposes, which means that even the people who do manage to visit the Cabinet of Masks are usually so focused on the famous floor mosaics that they barely notice the animal sculptures watching them from the shadows. Fact 7. A secret 800-meter escape tunnel saved popes running from Vatican City to the fortress of Castel Sant'Angelo is an elevated covered passageway that has saved multiple popes from assassination, invasion, and angry mobs over the past 700 years. The Passetto di Borgo, which literally means Little Passage of the Borgo, was built in 1277 as part of the defensive walls surrounding the Vatican, creating a secret escape route that would allow popes to flee to the safety of the fortress if the papal apartments were ever attacked. The corridor stretches about 800 meters, or roughly half a mile, and it's built right into the top of the ancient Leonine wall with a covered walkway that keeps anyone using it hidden from view below. The most famous use of the Passetto came in 1527 during the sack of Rome, when mutinous troops from the Holy Roman Empire invaded the city and began massacring civilians and looting churches. Pope Clement VII was celebrating Mass in the Sistine Chapel when he received word that thousands of soldiers were approaching the Vatican, and he immediately fled with his cardinals through the secret passage. Historical accounts describe the Pope running through the tunnel while holding up his white robes so he wouldn't trip, and the cardinals took turns covering him with their own red cloaks to make him less visible to the imperial arquebusiers who were shooting at the walls. The entire papal party made it safely to Castel Sant'Angelo, where they barricaded themselves inside for 7 months while Rome burned around them. And if the Passetto hadn't existed, Pope Clement would likely have been captured or killed. The tunnel wasn't just used for emergencies, though, as some popes would use it for private visits to the fortress or to move between locations without being seen by crowds of pilgrims or political enemies. Today, the Passetto di Borgo is occasionally open for guided tours, and visitors can walk the same route that terrified popes once ran while escaping for their lives. Fact 8. Pope Alexander VI's apartments were too scandalous. There's an entire floor of rooms in the Apostolic Palace that one pope refused to set foot in because the previous occupant's reputation was so toxic that he believed the air itself was contaminated. The Borgia apartments were lavishly decorated by Pope Alexander VI, who was born Rodrigo Borgia, and remains one of the most controversial figures ever to lead the Catholic Church, due to his numerous affairs, illegitimate children, and involvement in multiple murders and political conspiracies during his reign from 1492 to 1503. Alexander commissioned the artist Pinturicchio to cover the apartment walls and ceilings with elaborate frescoes depicting religious scenes. But he had himself painted into many of these scenes alongside his notorious children, Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, essentially creating propaganda artwork that showed the Borgia family as blessed and holy, despite their scandalous behavior being common knowledge throughout Rome. The apartments became infamous as the setting for the Borgia family's alleged orgies, poisoning plots, and various other sins that were whispered about in churches and taverns across Europe. When Pope Julius II was elected in 1503, just months after Alexander's death, he took one look at the Borgia apartments and declared that he would rather die than spend a single night in rooms that had housed such a corrupt and immoral predecessor. Julius believed that the very air inside those chambers was tainted by Alexander's sins, and instead of moving into the papal apartments as tradition demanded, he commissioned Raphael to create an entirely new set of rooms on the floor directly above the Borgia apartments. These became known as the Raphael rooms or Stanze di Raffaello, and they're now some of the most famous spaces in the Vatican museums, featuring masterpieces like the School of Athens. The Borgia apartments sat empty and locked for centuries, with many popes following Julius's example and refusing to use them, until Pope Leo XIII finally reopened them in the late 1800s after deciding enough time had passed that the scandal had faded into history. Fact 9. St. Peter's tomb lies 12 meters underground. Directly beneath the main altar of St. Peter's Basilica, there's an entire ancient Roman cemetery that goes down 12 meters or about 40 feet below the current floor level. And somewhere in that maze of tombs lies what many believe are the actual bones of Christianity's first pope. The Vatican necropolis, which comes from the Greek words for city of the dead, was discovered during excavations ordered by Pope Pius XI in the 1930s, after he specifically requested to be buried as close as physically possible to St. Peter's original grave. When workers began digging beneath the basilica, they found that the church had been built directly on top of an ancient Roman burial ground that contained both pagan and Christian tombs dating back to the 1st and 2nd centuries A.D. The necropolis contains elaborate mausoleums with frescoes depicting Roman gods alongside Christian symbols like the Chi Rho and the Good Shepherd, showing the transition period when Christianity was spreading through the Roman Empire, but pagan religions were still widely practiced. What makes this archaeological site even more remarkable is that tradition holds that St. Peter was crucified upside down in Nero's circus, which stood right next to this burial ground, and early Christians secretly buried his body in this cemetery sometime around 64 AD. Excavators found a simple grave beneath the altar marked with graffiti from ancient pilgrims that translates to "Peter is here" or "Peter is within," and scientific analysis of bones found in this location showed they belonged to a robust man in his 60s or 70s who died in the 1st century. Pope Paul VI officially announced in 1968 that these were the relics of St. Peter, though scholars continue to debate whether the identification can be proven with absolute certainty. The necropolis remains one of the most restricted areas of Vatican City, and visitors can only enter with special advance permission on guided tours that are limited to just 12 people at a time, making it one of the hardest tickets to obtain in all of Rome. Fact 10. Documents are classified for 75 years after death. The Vatican operates under one of the strictest document classification systems in the world, and the rules state that absolutely everything written by or about a pope remains completely secret and locked away until 75 years after that pope dies. This means that every letter, memo, meeting note, diary entry, diplomatic cable, and internal church document gets sealed in the archives the moment it's created, and nobody outside a tiny circle of officials can access these papers for at least 7.5 decades. The 75-year rule exists partly to protect the privacy and confidentiality of living people who might be mentioned in papal documents, and partly because the Vatican believes enough time needs to pass for historians to view events objectively without the emotional weight of recent memory clouding their judgment. This classification system created enormous controversy when it came to Pope Pius XII, who led the Catholic Church throughout World War II from 1939 to 1958, and whose actions during the Holocaust have been debated for decades. Critics accused Pius of maintaining public silence about Nazi atrocities against Jews and doing too little to help Holocaust victims, while defenders argued that he worked behind the scenes to save thousands of Jewish lives, and that speaking out more forcefully would have led to even greater Nazi retaliation against Catholics and Jews alike. The Vatican finally opened Pope Pius XII's archives in March 2020, which was exactly 75 years after his death in 1958, and scholars immediately began pouring through millions of documents looking for evidence that might settle the debate once and for all. Some of the newly released papers revealed that Pius had been informed about a plot by German military officers to assassinate Hitler in 1943, and that he may have quietly supported or encouraged this conspiracy despite the Church's official teaching that assassination is sinful, though the details remain murky and subject to interpretation. Fact 11. Napoleon's men never found hidden treasures. When Napoleon Bonaparte conquered Italy and seized control of the Vatican in 1810, he didn't just want to humiliate the Pope, he wanted to steal the most valuable documents in the Catholic Church's possession and transport them back to Paris as trophies of war. French troops began systematically packing up the Vatican archives, loading thousands of volumes and individual documents onto wagons to be shipped across the Alps to the Archives Nationales in France, where Napoleon planned to use them to legitimize his power and embarrass his enemies. The Vatican's chief archivist at the time was a clever man who knew that the French soldiers were too impatient and poorly educated to carefully examine every single document they were stealing, so he hatched a plan to save some of the most precious items in the collection. Among the threatened documents was a letter from King Henry VIII of England written in 1530, asking Pope Clement VII to grant him an annulment from his first wife Catherine of Aragon so he could marry Anne Boleyn, which was the request that eventually led to England breaking away from the Catholic Church and creating the Church of England. The archivist carefully rolled up this enormous letter, which featured Henry's signature and royal seal, and he hid it inside a secret compartment built into a wooden chair in his office, betting that the French troops would either overlook the chair entirely or would be too lazy to examine its construction closely enough to discover the hidden drawer. His gamble paid off perfectly as Napoleon's men ransacked the archives and carted away 3,000 cases of documents, but never found the concealed letter sitting right under their noses. The Henry VIII annulment letter remained hidden in that chair even after Napoleon's defeat and the eventual return of most of the stolen archives to Rome in 1817, and it wasn't rediscovered until Vatican archivists were doing inventory work decades later and noticed the chair had unusual weight distribution that suggested a hidden cavity. Fact 12. The Nicolene Chapel is a hidden Renaissance gem tucked away in the oldest section of the Apostolic Palace. Is a tiny chapel that most art historians consider one of the most beautiful rooms in the entire Vatican, and almost nobody gets to see it because it's locked away in a restricted area that's rarely open to the public. The Nicoline Chapel, named after Pope Nicholas V, who commissioned it between 1447 and 1455, represents one of the earliest examples of Renaissance art in the Vatican and served as the Pope's private prayer space where he could worship alone or with a small group of advisors away from the crowds and ceremonies of the larger basilicas. Pope Nicholas hired the artist Fra Angelico, who was a Dominican friar and one of the greatest painters of the early Renaissance, to cover the chapel's walls with frescoes depicting the lives of two early Christian martyrs, Saint Stephen and Saint Lawrence. Fra Angelico filled the small room with brilliant blues and golds, creating scenes that show these saints preaching to crowds, performing miracles, and ultimately being executed for refusing to renounce their faith, with Stephen being stoned to death and Lawrence being roasted alive on a gridiron. What makes these frescoes particularly special is that they were painted before the high Renaissance style of Michelangelo, and Raphael became dominant, so they represent an earlier, more delicate approach to religious art that emphasizes spiritual devotion over dramatic action or perfect anatomical accuracy. The chapel's intimate size, measuring only about 6 meters by 4 meters, or roughly 20 feet by 13 feet, creates an incredibly powerful viewing experience because Fra Angelico's paintings surround you on all sides and you can see every brushstroke and detail up close. Pope Nicholas chose to decorate his personal chapel with stories of martyrs because he believed the Pope needed constant reminders that leading the Church might require ultimate sacrifice, and he wanted to meditate on these saints' courage every time he prayed in this space. The Nicoline Chapel remains locked to regular visitors and is only occasionally open for specialized art tours or important church officials, making it one of the most exclusive and rarely seen Renaissance treasures in the world. Fact 13. The Room of Parrots housed actual parrots. There's a room in the Vatican with a strange name that sounds like it might be metaphorical or symbolic, but it turns out the name is completely literal because there really were exotic parrots living inside this space for many years. The Room of the Parrots, also called the Sala dei Paramenti or the Room of Chiaroscuri depending on which period of history you're talking about, served as a gathering place for the Pope's personal household staff and inner circle of advisors during the 15th and 16th centuries. This large hall was used for secret consistories, which were private meetings where the Pope would consult with his most trusted cardinals about sensitive matters of church politics, doctrine, or diplomatic strategy that couldn't be discussed in public settings. The room earned its unusual nickname because several Renaissance popes kept cages of colorful parrots and other exotic birds in this space, likely because these tropical creatures were considered symbols of wealth and power in an era when importing live animals from Africa or South America was extremely difficult and expensive. Having a room full of squawking parrots also served a practical security purpose, as the birds would become agitated and make noise if strangers tried to enter the space, essentially functioning as an early warning system against eavesdroppers or assassins trying to sneak up on private meetings. The ceiling of the Room of the Parrots was originally painted by Raphael's workshop in the early 1500s with elaborate grotesque decorations, which was a style of ornamental painting inspired by ancient Roman designs that featured fantastical creatures, plants, and geometric patterns intertwined in complex arrangements. Unfortunately, these original frescoes were severely damaged when imperial troops ransacked the Vatican during the sack of Rome in 1527, and later restoration work covered up much of Raphael's original artwork with newer paintings that don't match the quality or style of the Renaissance masters. Today, the Room of the Parrots is occasionally used for special exhibitions or events, but remains closed to regular tourists most of the year. Fact 14. A lost document cleared the Knights Templar. For almost 700 years, the Knights Templar were believed to have been condemned as heretics by the Catholic Church based on confessions extracted through torture. But in 2001, a Vatican researcher found a document the size of a dining table that had been misplaced in a box and completely forgotten, and this parchment proved that the entire historical narrative was wrong. The Chinon parchment, named after the Château de Chinon in France where the investigation took place, records the secret trial of Templar leaders conducted by Pope Clement V's personal representatives in August of 1308. The document measures 60 centimeters by 58 centimeters, making it roughly the size of a large placemat or small poster, and it contains the testimony of Jacques de Molay and other high-ranking Templars who were being held prisoner by King Philip IV of France on charges of heresy, idol worship, and various other crimes. What makes the Chinon parchment so important is that it shows Pope Clement's investigators actually found the Templars innocent of heresy after interviewing them, and the Pope himself granted them absolution and welcomed them back into the Church as faithful Christians who had been falsely accused. This completely contradicts the popular historical understanding that the Catholic Church condemned and destroyed the Knights Templar, when in reality it was King Philip who wanted them eliminated because he owed the Templars enormous debts that would disappear if the order was destroyed and their assets seized. The parchment had been properly catalogued in the Vatican archives when it first arrived sometime before the 1500s. But at some point during the centuries that followed, it was misfiled and placed into a box with other documents from a completely different time period and subject matter, where it sat unexamined because scholars had no reason to look for Templar documents in that particular collection. Raphael, an Italian paleographer working in the archives, discovered the Chinon parchment while researching an unrelated topic and immediately recognized its significance when she started reading the medieval Latin text and realized what she was holding. The Vatican published a full reproduction of the document in 2007, and historians have been debating its implications ever since. Fact 15: archives hold letters from Michelangelo. Complaining among the millions of documents stored in the Vatican archives, there are personal letters from some of the greatest artists in history, and it turns out that even Michelangelo had to deal with bureaucratic frustrations and payment problems that would sound familiar to anyone who's ever worked on a big project. One letter from Michelangelo addressed to Pope Julius II in the early 1500s contains a blunt warning that the Vatican's Swiss guards hadn't been paid in 3 months and were threatening to quit their posts and leave Rome if they didn't receive their wages soon. Michelangelo was working on painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling at the time, which was one of the most important artistic commissions in history. But he found himself in the awkward position of being surrounded by angry, unpaid security guards who were complaining to him about their financial problems because they knew he had the Pope's ear. The artist wrote to the Pope explaining that the guards were becoming increasingly desperate and that some of them had families to feed and debts to pay, and he worried that if they actually followed through on their threat to abandon their posts, the entire Vatican would be left vulnerable to criminals or political enemies who might take advantage of the security gap. What makes this letter particularly interesting is that it shows the chaotic and often dysfunctional nature of Vatican management during the Renaissance, when even basic administrative tasks like paying the guards on time seemed to fall through the cracks because everyone was too focused on grand artistic and political projects to worry about mundane details like payroll. The letter also reveals that Michelangelo, despite being one of the most famous and respected artists of his era, still had to act as a messenger and problem solver for other people's issues because the Vatican's organizational structure was so informal that there was no clear chain of command for the guards to follow when raising complaints. Unfortunately, the Vatican archives don't contain any record of how Pope Julius responded to Michelangelo's warning or whether the guards ever received their back pay, leaving historians to wonder whether the payment crisis was resolved peacefully or whether some of the guards actually quit and left Rome as they had threatened.